He carried his son into the restroom of a subway station, and when someone knocked on the door wanting to use it, he immediately covered his son's ears, then desperately pressed his foot against the door. Life was truly too hard, but he did not want his son to see how cruel reality could be, and he still wanted to protect his son's innocence with everything he had. This is a story adapted from real events, and it is also one of the greatest inspirational films in world cinema history, with 1.4 million viewers giving it a 9.2 rating, and more than 60% of them giving it a perfect score, simply because this film gave them the strength to climb out of the lowest points in life. The story begins in 1981, when an economic crisis broke out in America, and the world seemed to be split into two halves, with wealthy people driving sports cars on one side, and people with nothing left struggling on the streets on the other. At that time, President Reagan was reporting the bleak economic situation with a heavy heart. Sitting in front of the television was a worried black man named Chris, who had been unemployed for a long time, with less than $200 left in savings, 3 months behind on rent, forced to send his child to the cheapest and most rundown school, and even his car had been towed because he could not pay his parking tickets. To keep the family going, his wife worked 2 jobs, one during the day and one at night, and the pressure left her exhausted, anxious, and short-tempered. The reason they had fallen so low was simple. Before the economic crisis broke out, Chris had spent all his savings buying a batch of medical devices, thinking he could make a huge profit, only to find that he could not sell them at all. But in order to survive, Chris still had to carry the machine every day and desperately pitch it to doctors. And even when he forced a smile onto his face, he could not hide the exhaustion in his heart. Chris had not truly smiled in a long time, until one day, he passed by an office building where everyone seemed to be wearing a happy smile. He asked a man driving a luxury car for advice.
I got 2 questions for you. What do you do and how do you do it?
The man said he was a stockbroker and that the job did not require a very high degree. As long as someone was good enough at math and knew how to deal with people. This requirement sounded very simple because Chris had been best at math when he was in school, and his long years of sales experience had trained him to read people and handle situations. Chris made up his mind to work there because he also wanted to have that kind of happiness, but his wife laughed at Chris for dreaming too big, saying he would be better off using the time to make a few more sales calls. But this did not shake Chris at all, and he applied for an internship at the brokerage firm. But because he did not have enough education or experience, every resume he sent out disappeared without a response. But Chris did not give up, and he waited outside the company entrance for a month, until the HR manager finally appeared, and then he rushed forward to introduce himself with enthusiasm. The manager was in a hurry to deal with something, and after brushing him off with a few words, he was about to get into a taxi. So Chris thought quickly and said he was going the same way as the manager and wanted to share the ride. In the car, Chris kept trying hard to introduce himself, but the manager did not even look at him, because all his attention was on playing with a Rubik's Cube, which was the most popular toy at the time. The HR manager said that no one could solve all 6 sides, but Chris said he could, and that he could finish it before they reached the destination. So the two of them made a bet. Chris took the Rubik's Cube, thought for a moment, and while turning it, he explained the key points, and soon he solved the first side, making the manager glance at Chris in surprise. Then came the second side, and then the third side. Under the manager's praise, Chris became more and more careful with every move, because he knew this was the only chance he could grab right now. Soon, they arrived at the destination, and all 6 sides of the Rubik's Cube were finally solved, leaving the manager completely stunned, while even the driver could not help turning his head to look. According to news reports, even math professors needed half an hour to solve a Rubik's Cube, but Chris had done it in less than 10 minutes. Chris breathed a sigh of relief, but he soon realized that the manager had not paid the fare, and when he looked at the $17.10 on the meter, Chris pretended to stay calm and told the driver to head back. When the car stopped at a red light, he quickly pulled open the door, grabbed his device, and ran, shouting apologies as he ran, while the driver cursed him for being shameless and chased him all the way to the subway station. Just as the subway doors were about to close, Chris rushed into the train in a panic, but his device got stuck outside the doors. And even though he refused to let go and an elderly man inside the train came over to help, there was still nothing they could do. He called his wife and said he would not make it in time to pick up their child, asking her to hurry to the school. But his wife said she was going to take their son and leave Chris. Chris hurried onto a bus and rushed home, with rain and sweat sliding down his cheeks, and his heart feeling like it was bleeding. But he still did not even have the right to cry. He could not understand why, when he had clearly tried so hard to do everything right. Happiness had still never knocked on his door. When Chris ran back home, he found that his wife and son had indeed already left, and he sat in the darkness in despair, as if the entire world had abandoned him. Early the next morning, Chris stopped his wife at the entrance of the kindergarten, but she refused to waste even one more word on him. To keep his son with him, Chris directly picked his son up and brought him back home. But the landlord told Chris that he had been behind on rent for too long, and that he had to move out. Chris begged the landlord to give him one more week, saying he was willing to paint the apartment to pay off the debt, and the landlord agreed. And on that very day, the HR manager finally called and informed Chris that he could come to the company for an interview. The next day, while Chris was busy painting the walls, there was suddenly a knock downstairs, and it was the police, because Chris had not paid his parking tickets for a long time. Even if he paid them all this time, he still had to stay in a holding facility until 9:30 the next morning. But the next day at 10:30, he had to go to his interview, and his child was still at home. Chris desperately begged the officer to give him a break, but the other side could do nothing about it. With no other choice, Chris had to ask his wife once again to take care of their son. The next morning, after being released, Chris rushed out of the holding facility, with no time to shower or change clothes, paint still on his face, and ran toward the company as if his life depended on it. When he arrived at the interview room, Chris warmly shook hands with every interviewer, but seeing him looking so messy, everyone found it unbelievable, and the HR manager felt even more embarrassed, since Chris was the person he had recommended. But Chris calmly explained that he had been held because he had not paid his parking fines. By this point, everyone in the room was amused, but the boss still looked displeased, especially when he discovered that Chris only had a high school education, and he was so speechless that he started drawing on the paper. But Chris refused to sit there and wait for his fate, because he had to take the initiative.
Can I say something? I'm the type of person, if you ask me a question and I don't know the answer, I'm gonna tell you that I don't know. But I bet you what, I know how to find the answer, and I will find the answer. Is that fair enough?
This caught the boss's interest, and he gave Chris the ultimate challenge.
What would you say if a guy walked in for an interview without a shirt on? And I hired him. What would you say?
The question was very tricky, and if he answered carelessly, he could easily trap himself. But Chris gave a perfect answer.
You must have had on some really nice pants.
Chris's humor made the boss and everyone in the room laugh, and the boss was willing to give Chris the internship opportunity. But this time, Chris hesitated, because only now did he learn that this 6-month internship would not pay a single dollar. Not only that, but he also had to compete with 19 other interns for a full-time position. And in the end, the company would only hire the person in first place. This was a huge gamble, and if he failed, he and his son would be left with nothing to live on. But if he turned down the job and sold the remaining 6 medical devices, he could at least barely keep going. He wanted to give up, because he could not afford to gamble. But when he looked at his son's tiny figure, he suddenly found the determination to fight. He needed this job, and he had to build a better future for his son. Since he could not afford rent, he took his son and moved into an even cheaper motel. The father and son played basketball on the rooftop, and his son excitedly said that he wanted to join the NBA. Chris threw cold water on his dream, saying that his son had never been good at basketball since he was little, so his basketball skills probably would not go very far. His son was deeply disappointed and silently put the basketball back into the plastic bag. At that moment, Chris suddenly realized that he had said the wrong thing, and quickly said something else to his son.
Don't ever let somebody tell you you can't do something. Not even me. All right? You got a dream, you got to protect it. You people can't do something themselves, they want to tell you you can't do it. You want something, go get it. Period.
What he said to his son was also meant for himself. When he went to work on Monday, Chris arrived at the company neatly dressed, and his supervisor repeatedly emphasized that after the 6-month internship ended, the company would only hire the person with the highest performance and written exam score. Chris was full of motivation, arriving at the office earlier than anyone every day and carefully writing down every word his supervisor said. But because he was black, his supervisor always ordered him to do small errands, and Chris could only swallow the frustration. While working, Chris compressed his time to the absolute limit, because at 4 p.m., he had to pick up his son from kindergarten, and then take the bus across more than half the city back to the motel. Other people had 9 hours to complete the work, but he only had 6 hours. So while at work, he never drank water, so he would not have to go to the bathroom, and he did not even put the phone down, instead pressing the hang-up button directly and dialing the next number. By saving every second like this, he could gain 8 more minutes a day than everyone else. But this did not seem to help, because 2 months had passed, and Chris had not developed a single client. He realized that there was something wrong with his method, so he set his target on the richest and most difficult wealthy client. This wealthy man was named Walter, and he was the executive director of a retirement fund. Chris dialed the number, feeling extremely nervous, but unexpectedly, Walter happened to be free at that moment, and he told Chris to come see him within 20 minutes. Without saying another word, Chris rushed out of the company, but halfway there, the supervisor who often ordered him around stopped him, shoved a set of car keys into his hand, and told him to move his car. Chris had no choice but to agree, and by the time he finished everything and found Mr. Walter's secretary,
Oh, you just missed him.
Chris was completely disappointed. And what made him even more devastated was that his supervisor's car had also been given a parking ticket, so he could only accept it and pay the fine. But he did not lose heart. And that weekend, Chris took his son to find Walter and sincerely apologized to him. Very few people would personally come to apologize just because they were late. So Walter felt that Chris had good character and invited him to watch a game together. Chris had his own little plan too, and in order to make Walter feel comfortable handing his financial business to him, he tried hard to pretend that he was also a wealthy man, but he failed, and Walter still refused to work with him. However, by taking the chance to watch the game with a wealthy man, Chris met many rich people at the stadium, and these were all valuable connections that the company could never give him. What made Chris happiest was that over the next few months, he gradually sold all the remaining medical devices, and life seemed to be getting back on track. But right after that, a letter knocked him right back to where he started. Because Chris had not paid his taxes, the IRS took all the savings from his account. Chris was completely broke and had become penniless. When the landlord came to collect rent, he could only vaguely talk his way around it. That day, while Chris was in the park trying to think of a solution, he suddenly saw the device he had once left at the subway station in the hands of a homeless man. Chris took the device back and successfully found a buyer, only to discover that the device was already broken. He had no choice but to bring the device back to the motel, only to see their luggage thrown outside by the landlord, the lock changed, and the windows tightly shut. Chris was devastated, but his son still had no idea what had happened, and he lay on the ground, crying and insisting on going inside to sleep. Chris comforted his son and took him to the subway station. Looking at his son sitting on the bench, Chris felt heartbroken. To make his son feel a little happier, he pretended that the medical device was a time machine, and that as long as they pressed the button, they could travel back to the dinosaur age. And just like that, while playing a game of hiding from dinosaurs, Chris led his son into the public restroom, locked the door from the inside, and spread toilet paper across the floor. His son innocently thought they were still playing a game, and quietly fell asleep in his father's arms. Someone outside tried to open the door, and Chris pressed his foot against it with all his strength while covering his son's ears tightly. As a father, he desperately protected his son's innocence, hoping his child would not have to know the cruelty of reality and could grow up without worries. After silently shedding his tears, he still had to keep fighting. With nowhere else to go, Chris could only carry all his belongings with him and go to work. Among the bright and polished crowd, he felt unbearably embarrassed. After work, Chris searched everywhere for a free shelter, and after hearing that a church could take in people without a place to stay, he ran there with his son. The place was packed with homeless people, and when it was finally Chris's turn, there happened to be one last bed left. Before Chris could feel relieved, a homeless man suddenly cut in line, and Chris got into a scuffle with him on the spot. Fortunately, an elderly gentleman testified that Chris had been in line first, and only then did the father and son have a place to stay that night. After putting his son to sleep, Chris repaired the device in the hallway. At dawn, he studied professional knowledge by the light coming from outside. Yes, the misery of life did not defeat him, but instead made him even more determined. During the day, Chris worked desperately to meet clients, and after work, in order to grab a bed at the shelter, he ran wildly after the bus with his son, without even having time to pick up his son's favorite toy when it fell to the ground. Sometimes they were lucky enough to get a bed, and sometimes the father and son still had no choice but to sleep in a public restroom. But his son never complained, and while touching his father's chin, he said seriously,
"You're a good papa."
All right, go to sleep.
Perhaps it was exactly this sentence that helped Chris endure through such painful days. On the day of the company written exam, Chris was the second person to hand in his test paper, and by coincidence, he ended up riding the same elevator as the top student who had handed it in first. Chris could not help himself and wanted to compare answers with him.
I struggled with the essay question on the back. What did you write?
Essay question?
On the back.
When Chris walked out of the company, he happened to see the boss trying to get a taxi, and because the boss had not brought his wallet, he asked Chris to lend him $5. Chris could only open his wallet, rub the wrinkled bills inside, hesitate again and again, and finally grit his teeth as he took out the largest bill in his wallet, the $5 bill. The boss said thank you. That night, Chris went to sell blood and received $24. He spent $8 on parts to repair the device, because this device was his last hope. Late at night, Chris finally fixed the device, and when he pressed the switch, the light on the device suddenly lit up, becoming his only hope. Soon, Chris successfully sold the device, and $250 was enough for them to hold on for another month. In the final month, Chris went through every client he had met at the stadium, trying his best to do everything he possibly could, but he still did not know whether he could successfully get the job. On the last day of the internship, his supervisor called him into the conference room, and Chris immediately panicked, hurriedly put on his suit jacket, and strode into the room. This time, the big boss took the initiative to shake Chris's hand, praised Chris's shirt for looking nice, and hoped he would wear it again tomorrow, because tomorrow would be his first official day at work.
Would you like that, Chris?
Yes, sir.
Before Chris left the conference room, the boss took out the $5 he had borrowed from him. Chris turned around and walked out of the conference room with long, confident steps, passed through the office area, and arrived in front of the office building. In the middle of the bustling crowd, he raised his hands above his head with tears in his eyes and clapped hard for himself. Yes, happiness had finally knocked on his door, but to say it more accurately, Chris had been desperately knocking on the door of happiness all along. Years later, Chris founded his own brokerage company, and after work every day, the father and son no longer had to run desperately, but could take peaceful walks together. A well-dressed black man in a suit walked past them, and he was the real person this story was based on, Chris Gardner. The film was inspired by his real-life experience, because he could not afford his parking fines. He was once held, and in order to survive, he once sold blood and also stayed in parks and restrooms with his child. But what mattered most was that he never gave up, and he used every bit of strength he had to knock on the door of happiness.